Once upon a time, there was a man who invented chess. The king was so pleased, he offered the man a reward. The man, who was very wise, told the king he would only want 1 grain of wheat for the first square of the chessboard, 2 for the second, 4 for the third, and so on, doubling the amount for each square of the chessboard. The king thought the man was a fool, asking for a few kilos of wheat rather than gold. What the king did not know was that 64 doublings produce a quantity of grain higher than the total production in worldwide history. Therefore, he had to abdicate. That is the nature of exponential growth. Now imagine that instead of grain you have population, pollution, resource use, material consumption, and so forth. Our chessboard is planet Earth. This is the story of a group of futurists and scientists who have been warning about unlimited growth in a finite planet for 40 years, and an insight into their point of view today concerning the present crisis and the future of the world.
This is the first U.S. presentation of an 18-month study of global limits to growth, sponsored by the Club of Rome with Volkswagen Foundation funding, by an international team of 17 scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology under the direction of Dr. Dennis L. Meadows.
During the last year, a group of us at MIT, the principal members of which are with me here today, have been looking at the exponential growth of our global social and economic system. We've been led to 5 basic conclusions. There are physical limits to growth which, given current trends, are very likely to be encountered even during the lifetime of our children. Second, the most likely outcome of running into these limits, if we continue to ignore them and instead base our short-term policies on the assumption of continued growth, is that we'll overshoot those limits and collapse. The third conclusion is that we appear to have a viable alternative to this outcome, one in which population and material production could be brought into balance with a finite environment and with our resources. Fourth conclusion is that it's realistically going to take a period of 50 years, 100 years or more to reach that alternative in an orderly fashion. And finally, and I think this is extremely important, every year we delay beginning to form our goals and moving towards them makes an orderly transition to this stable situation much more difficult, and it decreases our ultimate options.
40 years ago, I stood up and presented a question. How can global society organize itself to provide a just, peaceful, equitable, decent living for its people? Now, after 40 years, finally, the question is starting to be considered seriously. But I'm apprehensive. I have to say that although the question is still important, the answer is different than it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it was still theoretically possible to slow things down and come to an equilibrium. Now that's no longer possible.
Today, crises are considered to be independent of each other. And when there's some problem, a hurricane or a financial collapse or chaos in the Eurozone or bankruptcy in some company or whatever, people focus on that as though somehow the causes of it were inside. Our book and our field generally says no. I mean, the causes often are far away in time and place from the symptoms of the problem. And indeed, my opinion is that all of these things are really not problems in themselves. They're a symptom. The problem is physical growth in a finite planet. The problem is that we have taken human population, food consumption, energy use, material consumption, and so forth, to levels which cannot be sustained.
Looking at separate crises as symptoms of a global crisis was also the anticipatory vision of the man behind the limits to growth. Aurelio Peccei, the founder of a mysterious think tank called the Club of Rome.
The Club of Rome is a group of scientists, humanists, educators, and businessmen who is very much concerned about the state of the world. We cannot say that we have economic and ecological and political, psychological and security problems. Each problem is a multifaceted problem.
Interconnected.
And each one interacts with the others. And many of these interactions are explosive.
Per mantenere la massima libertà di azione e di pensiero al Club di Roma, ai suoi membri e a se stesso, Peccei insisteva moltissimo sul fatto che il Club of Rome is not an organization, it is a non-organization. Cominciai a scrivere a persone i cui nomi comparivano sui giornali e allora io tutte le copie delle lettere mandate, le cosiddette veline dell'epoca fatte con carta carbone, cominciai a metterle insieme in un raccoglitore che battezzai Club di Roma. Allora lui disse: su quello scaffale tenga posto perché questa pratica si moltiplicherà presto.
They seem to regard you, the Club of Rome, as a secret right-wing organisation hell-bent on retaining the capitalist way of life. Governments tend to look at you as a left-wing organisation undermining precisely the same system. Where exactly do you stand?
Well, I presume somewhere in the middle. Basically, the Club of Rome is a body with trying to take a scientific objective point of view.
Peccei was one of the first to realize that the new problems humanity was facing were global, and he was looking for a scientific model to understand possible futures. Money was needed to start the research project, but there was a problem.
At that first meeting in Bern, being new and being an American, I thought the best thing for me to do was to have nothing to say and just to listen. And for the first time, about 6 o'clock in the evening, it was stated that the money was not available from the Volkswagen Foundation because no methodology had been settled on for doing the research. So now suddenly you had a project with no methodology and no money, which was very close to no project.
Jay Forrester from MIT, one of the pioneers of the modern computer age, was also the founder of system dynamics, the science that studies the interconnection between complex systems. He was probably the only person in the world able to give an answer to Peccei's willingness to understand the future. And he was in that room that day.
And I told them they could come to MIT and learn more about this, but they would have to come for 2 weeks or not at all, because I knew that it would take 2 weeks for them to really understand. And they agreed that they would come 3 weeks from that day. So it was on the airplane coming back, Air France I think, where I had 9 coach seats to myself. I converted them into an office to spread papers around and began to work on a system dynamic simulation model of what they had been talking about.
The
problem here is that these systems are what we have come to call counterintuitive. They do not behave the way we think they do. And there are reasons for this. The human mind has gathered its intuition and its experience in dealing with simple systems. Driving an automobile is about the most complex system that the human mind thoroughly grasps. As we come to these more complex systems, we apply to them the lessons that we've learned in simple systems, but the more complex systems do not behave in the same way. And it's the structure of the entire system that gives it the behavior.
This, my friend, is my recollection of the first couple of years at MIT. This is MIT, this is how it looked, this is the sunset, this is from our apartment. So I came to MIT in January 1970 to study physics. I discovered in 2 months' time that this was not the point. I happened to hear Forrester give a talk. I understood simply from listening to him that this was life. I managed to transfer into the management school. Then I got a desk in Eurogroup, and then basically came the June meeting. Yeah. Did Forrester then basically give you the responsibility to execute the program, or how was that done?
Well, so on the way back from the Bern meeting, Forrester, almost literally on a napkin, but on some sort of paper, drew a crude flow diagram for a global model. And he got home and, in his home computer over the weekend, programmed a model and had some runs. They were not scaled correctly. I remember they were about 25 feet long. But, typing out. This was in the days of selecting typewriters.
Exactly.
Then the executive committee came, and I remember after about a week, I came home to Donella one night. I said, this would be an interesting project. I think I know how to do it. So I wrote a 2-3 page proposal, gave it to the Club of Rome people the next day, and indeed, the club decided to take it. And then I put together the team, 16 people, 5 sectors, and so forth.
Jay Forrester handed over the baton to Dennis Meadows, and the average age of the international team of researchers Meadows put together was 26 and a half.
A lot of material from back in those days. All right, there I am as a graduate student at MIT. There came out a piece of paper among all the graduate students in that system dynamics research group saying there's an opportunity here, we have some funding, we have some couple of positions to work on this research program. I ran in Dennis's office as a graduate student and said, this is fascinating, I would like to be on that team. Dennis said, great, you were the first one in here, you get to be on the team.
Two members of the team, nominated by a senior member of the Club of Rome, came from Germany. Peter Milling and Eric Zahn.
Der Dennis und ich wurden dann reingerufen in den engeren Kreis der Club of Rome-Mitglieder. Das ganze Projekt ist ganz von Stiftung Volkswagenwerk bezahlt gewesen. Und damit das Team sofort beginnen konnte, hat Aurelio Becce einen Scheck gezückt und über $50.000 ausgeschrieben, sodass wir uns Tische, Stühle kaufen konnten und dass wir dann in einer alten Fabrikhalle direkt auf dem MIT-Gelände beginnen konnten. So we were eating, sleeping, everything in the office, yeah. And even had fun. We played frisbee in the office.
Aber im Wesentlichen war das eine Kerngruppe von 6 Leuten, ja, und mit der Leitung Dennis Meadows, stellvertretende Leitung Erich Zahn und wirklich der mit einer herausragenden Position, muss man sagen, von Donella Meadows.
Donella Meadows was the main author of The Limits to Growth. She was not only a scientist but also a humanist, a brilliant writer, and the team's link to the Green movement that was growing at the beginning of the 1970s.
I think we're one step, one contribution to a change which is indeed taking place, largely among young people who are trying many experiments, some of which may turn out to be very useful in an equilibrium society. And I think the thing that encourages me, I work in a university with some of these young people, is that they are discovering that the alternate lifestyles that they are trying are not sacrifices. They're not unpleasant. And in many ways, they're more satisfying and their lives are more fulfilling than they would have been if they followed the pattern which we have come to regard as the cultural pattern of America.
At that time, we were all optimists. Every single one of us believed that the research that we were doing and the book that we were writing was a prescription for optimism. Because we saw that these planetary issues were totally solvable, totally manageable. All it would take would be human action.
Eventually, I want to understand population, and one influence on population is deaths.
The Limits to Growth put together 12 possible scenarios of the future, varying from collapse scenarios to equilibrium ones.
And I've assumed that that's a function of food per capita.
The difference between collapse and equilibrium came from human choices. Professor John Sterman still teaches the content of the book at the MIT today. What did The Limits to Growth really say?
So what we have here is a very simple qualitative diagram showing the limits to growth concepts. Over here we have population, which grows exponentially unless restrained, unless people reduce their fertility. And here's the growth of the economy, which also grows exponentially. All that growth is happening in the context of a finite planet.
Important parts of the global system are basically structured to give exponential growth. Population and industrial growth are inherently exponential. It's not an accident that they show this explosive growth pattern. That's built into the nature of the systems.
When we approach the limits of the Earth, we will not basically move towards those limits and then smoothly fit in the world population and activity under the carrying capacity of the planet. We will, because of decision delays, shoot through the sustainable level and then move into unsustainable territory from which there is only one way back, either organized reduction, managed decline, or nature takes over and forces us down back to sustainable territory.
Obviously, if there are a lot of harmful side effects of our technologies, if there are long delays in the response of the social and technical system to scarcity, if the price system, if markets don't work effectively, we're in trouble. But the real lesson of Limits to Growth is that even if all of those things work, it still doesn't solve the problem as long as everybody wants more.
The Limits to Growth was a huge success worldwide. It was translated into more than 30 languages and sold more than 10 million copies. And the warning from the book soon began to spark huge public discussion.
There can be no doubt what one subject has aroused most controversy among scientists during the past 12 months. I mean, of course, the prospect of doom for mankind because of pollution, overpopulation, overuse of resources.
Well, I think that the conclusions of this study are completely wrong. If you check what happens if you vary all your assumptions together, then I understand from the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, who have actually been checking your model, the catastrophe disappears altogether.
That's interesting. I spent all last Friday down with the Science Policy Research Institute, and they didn't indicate that.
Well, this is developing debate who spoke to them last. I spoke to them this morning.
The limits to growth attacks the fundamental foundation of modern economics. If you don't have the idea that growth is desirable and possible, you don't have economics. And so as soon as the book came out, all the economists were just outraged. The first major criticism came out just a few weeks after The Limits to Growth. It appeared in the New York Times Book Review.
A whole page, first page. And it was written by 3 macroeconomists who were the forerunners of 30 years or 40 years of criticism of limits to growth. It's continuing to this day. You know, most classical macroeconomists thinks this is a piece of shit.
A projection for disaster. And this is so typical of the time. Here's an article entitled Starvation Spectre. World's Future, Faith or Suicide? It brings back the feelings of that time. It's like, guys, you're not getting our message. If we had 30 days to save the world, would we act before the 29th? Now that one actually got the message. We're dealing with dynamic systems with long time constants. Don't try to do it on the 29th day. Do it on the first or second day, and don't waste the first, second, third, and all the way to the 26th day talking about whether or not the science says we should.
In June 1972, a few months after the publication of The Limits to Growth, world leaders gathered in Stockholm for the very first environmental conference chaired by the Canadian Maurice Strong, who was deeply influenced by the book's message. A compromise between the interests of all countries was very difficult to find, but the global concern about the state of the planet was marked by the Stockholm Declaration.
And if it were to contain nothing more than that principle, that nations must accept responsibility for the consequences of their actions on others, it would be a historic document and an extremely important base on which to build.
We have to take a better care of our small planet. And that is the message which will come out from Stockholm, irrespective of the immediate political situations of the interests.
Dr. Mansholt, who, as you know, is the president of the European Economic Commission, he has tried to translate the ideas of the Club of Rome, the MIT report, into practical action.
Je ne sais pas si ce rapport de MIT est déjà publié en français, je ne crois pas.
Nous l'avons publié.
Ah, vous l'avez publié?
Dans un numéro spécial, oui.
Bon. Alors tout le monde l'a lu, je crois. En tout cas, dans mon petit pays, aux Pays-Bas, on l'a lu, en quelques semaines, on a vendu plus que 200 000 exemplaires. C'est le best-seller. Et ce n'est pas facile à lire.
The Limits to Growth had a strong impact in Germany, as well as in many other countries, dividing politicians and public opinion.
Immerhin hat der Club of Rome für Grenzen des Wachstums den Friedenspreis des deutschen Buchhandels bekommen. Das Buch stand über mehrere Jahre auf der Spiegel-Bestseller-Liste und es hat also auch in der Industrie einen sehr starken Widerhall gefunden. Ich habe beispielsweise, glaube ich, knapp über 60 Vorträge im ersten Jahr gehalten und die meisten vor Vertretern der Wirtschaft und in Unternehmen.
Wir wurden zum Teil eben Grenzen des Wachstums. Man müsste Bevölkerungsentwicklung beschränken, man müsste den Ressourcenverbrauch und die Umweltbelastung reduzieren und begrenzen. Wir wurden da als Kommunisten, als Planwirtschaftler, als alles Mögliche bezeichnet, was wir wirklich nun mal nicht sind und waren.
Wir waren auch bei vielen Diskussionen, Kritiken dabei. Da saßen wir aufgereiht da vorne und eine Menge von Journalisten und Experten in unterschiedlichen Gebieten, die bombardierten uns sehr ablehnende Haltungen, auch teilweise unreflektiert. Und es war aber interessant, dass der eine oder andere dann das doch besser verstanden hatte, was wir ausdrücken wollten. Weil interessant ist, dass viele entweder das Buch gar nicht oder sehr oberflächlich gelesen hatten.
Und dieses ist eine totale Desinformation und ist kein guter politischer Führungsstil.
Aurelio Peccei raised the stakes, bringing the content of the book to the highest levels of decision-making.
La nuova visibilità che stava acquisendo il Club di Roma gli permise nel 1974 di indire una riunione di capi di Stato e di Governo con l'appoggio del cancelliere austriaco Bruno Kreisky e la riunione si svolse a Salisburgo e parteciparono il presidente del Messico Echevarria, il presidente del Senegal Léopold Senghor, il primo ministro canadese Pierre Trudeau e il primo ministro svedese Olof Palme, che disse che lui sottoscriveva full-heartedly, con tutto il cuore, quello che gli andava dicendo Peccei, che però purtroppo se avesse preso delle posizioni così drastiche e impostato una politica così severa non lo avrebbero mai rieletto e quindi lui doveva scendere necessariamente a dei compromessi.
Imagine being in your 20s and finding yourself in the middle of a global controversy. How did the authors react?
The response they met was, particularly in the U.S., was really harsh and severe, calling them Malthusian or doomsday prophets and things like that. And that was a surprise. And each of the authors dealt with that and the following controversy that came up around the book in different ways.
When we wrote The Limits to Growth, I thought that once we told the world that the planet is small and that it's a great challenge for humanity to fit a large population and a large economy onto this tiny little planet, I had thought naively that the world would listen and say, yes, clearly this is good advice and we're going to follow this advice. It didn't take long before I really understood that that was not the case. And after 10 years of trying to push the message during the 1970s, I basically gave up and said that this is too early. We have to wait another 20 years or so until the real world problems become more acute and more easily observed by most people. And then we can start once more and try to assist a shift in the direction of sustainable development.
Dennis and Dana had left MIT, started up a research program at Dartmouth. Their interest was similar to mine, create sustainable communities on a small scale. I essentially followed them, went up to Dartmouth, started teaching and research at Dartmouth, and after one semester, 4 months roughly, decided that I had to make a right-hand turn in my life choice. Bought a small log cabin in the foothills of Vermont that had no power, no telephone, ran on kerosene lights, heated with burning firewood, created an organic garden, started raising animals, on a personal level. I'm going to do this and see what it takes to live in harmony and with a low carbon footprint. That term wasn't even developed at that time, by the way. But that's what we were talking about.
Donella Meadows' reaction was to continue teaching and writing columns and essays motivating people to envision the future.
I've been working on this vision of a sustainable world for a long time. I can literally see it A sustainable world that isn't a sacrifice or a bunch of difficult regulations, a sustainable world that I would love to live in. And having such a vision alive in me prevents me from selling out to something less that someone else may be offering me, such as the vision of perpetual economic growth, which is pretty much the vision that the whole field of economics gives us. Growth isn't what I want. Growth has nothing to do with what I want. And I think the only reason growth, which is a terribly abstract and when you think about it, stupid vision of the future, I think the only reason that can be sold so easily in every policy arena is that there's no alternative vision.
In recent years, so many claim that we live in a world of limits, where all nations, even those as bountiful as our own, must learn to live with less. Perhaps you remember a report published a few years back called The Limits to Growth. That title, Limits to Growth, said it all.
Why did President Reagan attack a little book more than 10 years after its publication? Because the limits to growth had become the bone of contention between Republicans and the previous Carter administration.
Negli Stati Uniti Pecei aveva conosciuto Zbigniew Brzezinski, di difficilissima pronuncia, che poi sarebbe diventato consigliere del presidente Carter. E Brzezinski gli aveva chiesto di scrivere una lettera a Carter per sensibilizzarlo sul pensiero del Club di Roma. E lui scrisse una lunga lettera in cui diceva che c'era una space window, come si dice, una finestra temporale in cui Carter, prima di guai peggiori, avrebbe potuto influire molto attraverso il suo potere, diciamo, sul miglioramento dei problemi globali.
By the end of this century, I want our nation to derive 20% of all the energy we use from the sun. Direct solar energy and radiation, and also renewable forms of energy derived more indirectly from the sun. This is a bold proposal, and it's an ambitious goal, but it is attainable if we have the will to achieve it.
What a difference a president makes. Remember 1980? Democratic Party leaders telling us that decline was inevitable, that these forces were beyond our control, and that America had reached its limits.
We believed then and now there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams. And we were right.
Short-termism really rules the world in the sense that most people, most politicians, most businesses, are more interested in the short-term interest than in creating a better world for our grandchildren.
They are the living image of the young people I have always in mind when we work. I think that we have prepared for them a very ugly world. We have to do something to correct what we have done so far.
L'ultima riunione si sarebbe dovuta tenere a Helsinki. L'ultimo ricordo che ho di lui è quando mi dettava quella che lui voleva diventasse un'agenda per la fine del secolo. Me la finì di dettare nel letto d'ospedale un pomeriggio alle 6, alle 4 di mattina mi telefonò la moglie che era morto.
And in some ways surprising, it's rather incredible that in this day of superpowers, of multinational corporations, of demagogues, and of mass media, that a single man with a few companions should have any influence to the extent that the Club of Rome and Aurelio have had.
Even though their mentor, Aurelio Pecei, was not there any longer, in 1992, 20 years after the publication of The Limits to Growth, Dennis and Donella Meadows and Jorgen Randers decided to test their scenarios.
These are pictures of Jorgen and Dennis and Dana, mostly taken at Foundation Farm in Plainfield, New Hampshire. And the whole team, Bill came over from Maine for this picture. The team reassembled again 20 years after the limits to growth. My role was as a researcher, digging up numbers on world trends. So food production, per capita food production, population changes. And there was really an open question, bringing the scenarios forward by 20 years. What were our options? And through that work, the title for the new book emerged, which was Beyond the Limits.
20 years ago, our feeling was that we were below the limits, although dangerously accelerating on our way to them. On the basis of the work we have done and the evidence which is everywhere available, we now conclude we are above the limits.
I don't consider myself any better than any other human being, but I have lived for 20 years with these global models. And I can see, I instinctively understand the global results of personal actions that I take. And I know what kind of world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a collapsing world. I don't want to live in a world, as Jürgen says, it's getting grayer and grayer. And it costs more and more and more to maintain even a decent standard of living. I want to live in a sustainable world where there is no poverty, no hunger, and no erosion of the Earth's resources.
1992 was also the year of the Rio United Nations Conference on the Environment. And 20 years after Stockholm, the limits to growth was still the enemy to fight.
20 years ago, some spoke of the limits to growth. And today we realize that growth is the engine of change and the friend of the environment.
World leaders have gathered 18 more times since Rio, and decisions are still being delayed.
Now I give the floor to European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. Although good progress in various tracks so far has been done, including on the finance, we really strongly feel that time is running out.
Pache and the Limits to Growth team tried their best to warn decision makers about the risks of unlimited growth. But even when apparently everyone agrees the risk is serious, as with climate change, action is still not taken.
When I was 27 and just did the limits to growth, I had a very different understanding of the world. You see, there's two general mentalities about policy. Scientists gather data and they say, oh my goodness, the sea level is going up, intensive storms are becoming worse, drought and precipitation patterns are becoming more difficult. There's climate change. We need to change our greenhouse gas emissions. The other mentality says, I don't believe climate change because the glaciers are actually getting bigger. And then the scientists do some studies and they say, no, actually the glaciers are getting smaller around the world. And then the climate skeptics say, well, actually I don't care about the glaciers so much. I don't believe in climate change. I refuse to take action now because the polar bears are actually better off than they used to be. Then the scientists do some work and they say, no, actually the polar bears are in terrible trouble now. They're drowning, they don't have any food anymore, the ice is going away for them. And the climate skeptic says, well, actually I don't care so much about polar bears, really. I don't believe in climate change because there was a lot of snow in Washington, D.C. last winter.
When I was a child, this little valley was full of small deciduous trees, crowded. And then over the last 50 to 60 years, they have died out due to competition, and the biomass is then concentrated into big trees like this. This is a Norwegian spruce, and it's very big, you know, for being this far north. You know, people think, what about plus 2 degrees centigrade? That's so little it doesn't really matter. but it actually moves timber lines 350 meters vertical. So what you have in the Alps at a certain level will move 350 meters up. What you have at the top will move into heaven and remain there. And these are tremendous shifts. And at the same time, the climate zones are moving towards the North Pole, by essentially 5 kilometers per year.
Science depends on agreement. That we can't ever be 100.000% certain about anything on the planet, but we can be 99.99% certain. And that's where we are about global climate change.
What do the Limits to Growth authors think about the future now? Bill Barron's choice to act has led to him personally installing solar panels all over New England for the last 20 years.
Solar energy worldwide is the most abundant form of energy. It's the lowest cost form of electrical energy now on the planet. Solar energy, in my view, has the greatest chance for us as a species of climbing back out of the hole that we've put ourselves into.
Jürgen Rander's answer is in a book entitled 2052, his forecast for the next 40 years.
The real challenge that I see, the real problem, is the possibility of self-reinforcing climate change in the second half of this century. I think that man will continue his emissions of greenhouse gases at such a rate that we will reach plus 3 degrees centigrade in 2080. And that's possibly enough to start melting the tundra, or at least it will move the border of the tundra further north, which releases methane and carbon dioxide from the frozen moss, which is essentially the tundra. And there are strong greenhouse gases, which of course then makes the temperature even higher, which then melts more tundra, which then releases more methane into the atmosphere. And if this process starts, there is then nothing man can do. It will go all the way until all the tundra is melted and all the methane is in the atmosphere.
Dennis Meadows keeps traveling the world, as he has been doing for the past 4 decades, updating and warning decision makers about the perspectives for the future from his point of view.
Het is voor mij een große vergnügen hier. Es tut mir leid, ich muss leider auf Englisch wechseln, weil mein technischer Wortschatz fehlt noch. Und ich hätte lieber klug auf Englisch statt dumm auf Deutsch sein.
Jetzt befinden wir uns in einer revolutionären Zeitspanne. Ich war am Alexanderplatz Samstag und da gab es eine Occupy Berlin-Demonstration. Die wissen nicht wirklich, was sie hier besetzen, die wissen auch nicht unbedingt das, was sie nun wirklich wollen, aber sie wissen, dass die gegenwärtige Situation ihnen nicht gefällt. Und dieses Gefühl, das wird von Millionen, von Hunderten von Millionen von Menschen überall auf der Welt geteilt. Wohin führt das? Ich weiß es nicht. Aber ich habe schon sehr oft gesagt, das glaube ich nach wie vor, dass in den nächsten 20 Jahren, also sagen wir mal bis 2030, sie mehr Wandel in diesem Land erleben werden, in dieser Union in Europa, als man sich vorstellen kann. Mehr Veränderung in 20 Jahren, als es in den gesamten 100 Jahren davor gegeben hat. Politischer Wandel, sozialer Wandel, Umweltwandel, auch wirtschaftsmäßig großer Wandel. Also wir leben da schon in einer Zeit, in der viele der Annahmen, die wir alle haben und die wir halten, verändert werden. Und das Ganze wird in unserer Lebenszeit passieren.
The Limits to Growth story shows that 40 years were lost. What are the actions we could take now, according to Jürgen Randers and Dennis Meadows?
Global problems affect everyone, but you only solve these problems if everybody works together. You can't solve climate change in Bucharest if they don't solve it in Beijing, Ankara, New York, and so forth. And the problem with these problems is that usually if you want to take action, you pay now here, and the benefits come later over there. Universal problems give a different possibility. They affect everybody, but like air pollution, soil erosion, flooding, deforestation, you can solve them here for you, and the benefits come here soon. The second way we have to change is to quit imagining we're going to get sustainability and start seeking resilience. It's moving from sustainable development to survivable development. Resilience is the ability to absorb a shock and to keep giving essential functions. So, for example, in Fukushima, the resilient cities were rather quick able to start giving again food and water to their people. The ones which didn't do it were not resilient. We say they were brittle.
All we need to do in order to solve the climate problem is to shift of the order of 1 to 2% of the world's employment and capital from dirty sectors to clean sectors. So we ask the capitalist system, can capitalism actually help us shift the investment flows? And of course the answer is no. Capitalism is made in order to allocate capital to the most profitable project, not to the projects that are societally beneficial. So capitalism will not solve this problem. Couldn't then society regulate capitalism in such a manner that what is societally beneficial also becomes the most profitable? And the answer is, of course, yes. In principle, society could agree that, for instance, putting a price on climate gas emissions, a carbon price, which will make it profitable to invest in electric cars rather than in fossil cars. But of course, that requires parliaments to pass this regulation, and parliaments is composed of politicians who have voters, and voters are also short-term in the sense that voters are not in favor of increased gasoline prices or increased power prices. So the core problem is short-termism in the individual, reflected in democracy and reflected in capitalism, which are two systems of governance that we have chosen to guide our lives. That's the problematique. The problematique sits in you and I and everyone else. It's the short-term nature of the human being.
The first chart in the Limits to Growth book in 1972 was called Human Perspectives, and its caption read, "Although the perspectives of the world's people vary in space and time, every human concern falls somewhere on the space-timer graph." The majority of the world's people are concerned with matters that affect only family or friends over a short period of time. Others look further ahead in time or over a larger area, a city or a nation. Only a very few people have a global perspective that extends far into the future.
It is amazing. We have now lived for 40 years with shock after shock after shock after shock. And in most cases, even in the financial crisis, which was mishandled as badly as any crisis will be, the system is surprisingly resilient.
The system is surprisingly resilient, especially for the rich.
Yeah, for sure. But
there are people who still today are totally devastated by the consequences of the 2008 crisis. From our perspective, yes, it was resilient, but there are billions of people who say, no, it was not resilient, it was a disaster. Now, let me say, on the other hand, in your book, I admired that you start to raise some issues that people don't talk about very often. Is democracy really an effective governance form for coping with these problems? I don't say anything about my preference for it or the morality of it, but we can just say objectively, democratic nations are not getting in control of CO2 emissions. They're not getting in control of environmental damage from global perspectives and so forth. And so it's important to raise those issues, get people to start thinking about it. That you did. I thought that was fine.
Did you know that the Norwegian Parliament unbelievably allocated, $50 million or something like this, a fairly high amount of money, to build this seed vault? They found a cool hillside where there is permafrost to keep this at minus 35 degrees centigrade for as long as they can. And they have then offered to all nations to store whatever they want in the form of genetic material. And it's interesting, in my mind, very forward-looking. I would not have thought that a democracy would be willing to do that type of thing, which is for some kind of undefined group sometime far in the future. So luckily, in some cases, I am wrong.
Donella Meadows passed away in 2001, but her memory is still inspiring many people around the world. Among them are the members of Cobb Hill Farm in Vermont, a project started by Donella. Some dreams come true.
People from this part of New England and all over the world really have been interested in the experiment that we're doing here. People will come and volunteer to help work on the farm, to learn about agriculture and sustainable agriculture. Cobb Hill was first an idea that occurred to Dana Meadows in about 1996 or 1997. At the time, my husband and I were part of that circle of people who were intrigued by that idea. And we spent about 5 years imagining what it could be, visiting land and farms all over Vermont. Dana, originally her vision was that it would be a place where people lived, an organic farm that produced the food, and a research institute, which became the Sustainability Institute. She had this way of inviting and welcoming everyone else around her into the vision, and so that it became all of our visions.
So, what is your vision? What do you really want? What will make this a world that would make you excited to get up in the morning and go to work in it? That would make you feel wonderful about the possible future for your children and your grandchildren, excited at what they will have the opportunity to bring forth. What kind of world would that be?